Module 11, Adaptation Finance. Here's a puzzle that should bother you. The world has broadly agreed that adaptation matters, that helping communities cope with floods, droughts, heat, and rising seas is a moral and practical necessity. And yet, of all the money moving through climate finance, only a thin trickle reaches adaptation. The gap between what's needed and what's flowing is enormous, and it's not closing. This isn't an accident, and it isn't only about political will. There's something about the nature of adaptation itself that makes finance struggle with it. This module is about that something and what's being done to fix it. By the end of this module, you'll understand three things: why adaptation is structurally the hard case for finance in a way mitigation is not, the actual size of the adaptation gap and how underfunded it is, and the ideas trying to change this, from locally led adaptation to the doubling pledge, COP30's tripling call, and the global goal on adaptation. Let me start with the core reason adaptation is so hard to finance, because this is the single most important idea in the module, and you, as a climate person, will feel it immediately once it's put in finance terms. Go back to the very first thing we learned about finance, all the way in Module 2. Private money invests where it can earn a return. Money flows toward projects that generate revenue, a stream of cash coming back to whoever put the money in. Now ask yourself, what revenue does an adaptation project generate? Think about a concrete one: a seawall protecting a coastal town, a mangrove belt buffering a village from storm surge, an early warning system for floods, a program teaching smallholder farmers drought-resistant techniques. Every one of these is genuinely valuable, but none of them sells a product. None of them produces a stream of cash that flows back to an investor. The seawall doesn't send anyone a monthly bill. The value it creates is disaster avoided, damage that didn't happen, suffering prevented. That value is real, but it's diffuse, it's spread across a whole community, and it shows up as an absence, the flood that didn't drown the town, rather than as revenue in someone's account. This is what economists call a public good, and it's the beating heart of why adaptation struggles. A public good is something that benefits everyone in common and that no single person can be charged for or excluded from. The protection a seawall gives is shared by the whole town whether or not each person paid. And because you can't easily charge for it, private investors can't earn a return on it, so private money stays away. Which means adaptation falls, overwhelmingly, to public money, to governments, donors, and the climate funds, precisely the money that's most scarce and most fought over. But surely you can find the revenue if you're clever. Couldn't you charge the protected businesses a fee, or structure it somehow so private money comes in? Sometimes, at the edges, yes, and people work hard at it. You can occasionally bolt a revenue stream onto an adaptation project, a resilient toll road that charges tolls, an irrigation scheme where farmers pay for water, a resilient port that earns fees. And blended finance, from Module 9, can stretch things by using public money to crowd in a little private capital. But be honest about the limits. The core of adaptation, the seawall, the early warning system, the mangroves, the drought training for subsistence farmers, mostly cannot be turned into a business, because the people it protects are often the poorest and can least afford to pay, and the benefit is avoided harm rather than a sellable product. So while you should look for revenue where it genuinely exists, you should be deeply suspicious of any promise that private finance will ride to the rescue of adaptation at scale. The math mostly doesn't work, and pretending it does can become an excuse to keep public money away. There's a second structural problem, and again you'll recognize it from the climate side. Adaptation is hard to measure. In mitigation, there's a clean common unit, a ton of carbon dioxide avoided, the same everywhere in the world. That single number is what makes results-based payments and carbon markets possible, as we saw last module. Adaptation has no such unit. How do you measure resilience? How do you prove that a community is now better able to withstand a drought that hasn't happened yet? You can count seawalls built, but that's counting activity, not the actual outcome, which is harm avoided in an uncertain future. This measurement problem makes adaptation harder to fund through results-based mechanisms, harder to report on, and harder to prove worked, all of which makes finance nervous. And there's a third piece. Much of the value of adaptation is local, specific, and small in scale. A flood warning system for one river basin, a seed variety suited to one region's soils. These don't aggregate neatly into the large, standardized deals that big investors and big funds prefer. There are thousands small, particular things, each needing local knowledge to design well. That's a virtue for effectiveness and a headache for finance, which likes size and standardization. There's a fourth difficulty that follows from these, and it's one you'll feel acutely in your own work. Adaptation is hard to define at the edges. A road is a road, but is a road built a little higher and stronger to survive floods and adaptation project, or just a road? A better seed is agriculture, but a drought-tolerant seed is also adaptation. Because so much of adaptation is really about doing ordinary development slightly differently, more resilient roads, more resilient farms, more resilient water systems, it can be genuinely hard to draw a line around the adaptation project and put a price on it. This makes adaptation finance easy to overstate on paper by relabeling ordinary projects and hard to track honestly. When you see an adaptation finance figure, always ask what's actually inside it, because the category is slippery in a way that a solar farm never is. This slipperiness is also why donors sometimes appear to be doing more on adaptation than the money on the ground would suggest. So put those three together, no revenue, hard to measure, local and small, and you understand why adaptation is chronically starved. Now let me give you the numbers, and I want you to remember these, because as a practitioner you'll quote them often. The UNEP Adaptation Gap Report of 2024 estimates that developing countries' adaptation needs and costs run to somewhere between $187 billion and $359 billion per year over this decade. That's the need. Now here's what's actually flowing. International public adaptation finance to developing countries was only about $28 billion in 2022. Sit with that contrast. $28 billion flowing against a need of at least $187 billion and possibly $359 billion every year. The gap is on the order of 10 to 1 or worse. And while adaptation flows have grown slowly, the need has grown faster, so the gap has been widening, not closing. Compare that to mitigation, which we'll take up in detail next module, and which attracts the large majority of all climate finance, because it has revenue-generating projects like solar farms and wind farms that private money is happy to fund. The imbalance between mitigation and adaptation isn't a small skew. It's the defining inequity of climate finance, and it maps almost exactly onto the structural reasons we just walked through. And notice the cruel geometry of it. The countries with the greatest adaptation needs, the least developed countries and small island states, are usually the ones with the least capacity to attract any private money at all, and the least fiscal room in their own budgets, because, as we saw in the debt module, so much of their revenue goes to servicing debt. So the need is highest exactly where the ability to meet it is lowest. Adaptation finance is not just underfunded in total. It's maldistributed, tilting toward the middle-income countries and the more investable, revenue-adjacent projects, and away from the poorest people facing the sharpest risks. When you hear a headline number about adaptation finance rising, always ask the second question: rising for whom and reaching where? The aggregate can improve while the places that need it most see almost nothing. Given all this, isn't the whole system just rigged against the poorest? What's actually being done, beyond people at conferences saying adaptation matters? Several real things, and they're worth knowing by name because they're the levers a practitioner can actually push. Let me give you the main ones. The first is a set of political commitments to force more money toward adaptation. At the Glasgow COP in 2021, developed countries pledged to at least double their collective adaptation finance to developing countries from 2019 levels by 2025, the doubling pledge. That was a floor, and it was widely seen as insufficient even if met. Then at COP30 in Belém in 2025, the global Muturo decision went further. It calls for efforts to triple adaptation finance by 2035 against a 2025 baseline. Now, notice the careful language, calls for efforts too. These are not hard, enforceable guarantees, they're political signals, and the history of the 100 billion goal from Module 1 should keep you appropriately skeptical about whether pledges get met on time. But they matter, because they set a benchmark that campaigners and vulnerable countries can hold donors to. And there, the reason adaptation is finally getting a bigger share of attention. The second lever is inside the funds themselves. Recall from the architecture modules that the Green Climate Fund targets a 50-50 split between mitigation and adaptation, with half of its adaptation money earmarked for the most vulnerable, the least developed countries, small island states, and Africa. That 50-50 rule is deliberately designed to fight the natural drift of money toward mitigation. The Adaptation Fund, the Least Developed Countries Fund, and the Special Climate Change Fund all exist precisely to channel money to this hard case. Knowing which door leads to adaptation money is a core practitioner skill, and these are the doors. The third lever, and the one I most want you to carry, is locally led adaptation. This is a principle, and increasingly a movement, that says adaptation works best when the people who actually face the climate risk have real power over the money and the decisions, not just as consultees, but as decision makers. The logic is straightforward once you say it. A flood adaptation plan designed in a distant capital or a donor's headquarters will miss the specific realities of a specific village, which way the water actually comes, which crops actually survive, who in the community actually gets left out. The people living there know these things. Locally led adaptation pushes money and authority down to the local level, to community organizations and local governments, so that adaptation is designed by those who will live with it. There's a set of principles for this that many funders have now endorsed, and as someone operating in-country, you're often the bridge that makes it real or lets it fail. But be honest about the tension here, because it's one you'll live inside. The big funds and banks are built to move large sums with heavy safeguards, audits, and reporting, and that machinery is fundamentally at odds with pushing small amounts of money and real authority down to a village committee. A community organization that knows exactly how to protect its own coastline may have no way to meet a global fund's accreditation and reporting requirements, which we'll cover in Module 15. So the money that most wants to be local runs into a system that most wants to be big. Closing that gap, finding ways to get funds to flow to the local level without either drowning communities in paperwork or abandoning all accountability, is some of the most important and least glamorous work in the whole field. Intermediaries who can translate between a village's reality and a fund's rulebook are worth their weight in gold, and in your context, that intermediary is often you. There's a fourth lever worth naming, and it's the quiet one, making adaptation cheaper to justify by getting better at valuing avoided harm. Part of why adaptation loses out is that its benefit, the flood that didn't happen, is invisible and in the future, while a project's costs are visible and now. A growing body of work tries to put honest numbers on avoided damage, so that a decision maker can see that $1 spent on a sea wall or an early warning system saves several dollars of future disaster. When that case is made well, adaptation stops looking like pure cost and starts looking like an investment that pays for itself in avoided losses. It won't create private revenue, so it won't fix the core problem, but it can strengthen the argument for the public money that adaptation depends on. And as a practitioner making the case to your own finance ministry, it's a powerful frame to have. Now let me close the module with a piece of machinery you'll hear about constantly and should understand: the global goal on adaptation, usually shortened to the GGA. Mitigation has a clear global goal: hold warming well below 2 degrees, ideally 1.5. Adaptation, under the Paris Agreement, was given its own global goal, but it was defined only in vague terms to enhance adaptive capacity and resilience. The problem was that a vague goal can't be tracked, and what can't be tracked can't drive money. So a long effort has been underway to give the GGA real substance through a set of measurable indicators, so the world can actually see whether adaptation is progressing. At COP30 in Belém, countries adopted 59 indicators, out of a proposed 100, to start measuring progress on the global goal on adaptation, with a 2-year period to refine them further. But, and this is the detail a practitioner must catch, that decision came with explicit language that these indicators create no new financial obligations. In other words, the world agreed on ways to measure adaptation, while carefully avoiding any binding commitment to pay for it. That tension, measurement advancing faster than money, is the story of adaptation finance in one line. It connects straight back to the measurement problem we discussed. Everyone wants metrics, and metrics are genuinely useful, but metrics are not money, and the gap between the two is exactly where your work lives. So, to bring it together, adaptation is the hard case for finance for three structural reasons. It usually generates no revenue, so private money stays away and it falls to scarce public funds. It's hard to measure, lacking mitigation's clean ton of carbon unit, and it's local and small, resisting the big standardized deals finance prefers. The numbers are stark. A need of roughly $187 to $359 billion a year against only about $28 billion flowing in 2022, a gap that's widening. And the responses to no are the doubling pledge and COP30's call to triple adaptation finance by 2035. The deliberate adaptation earmarks inside funds like the GCF, the push for locally led adaptation that puts money and power in the hands of those facing the risk, and the global goal on adaptation with its new but non-binding indicators. Next, we cross to the other side of that divide, to mitigation and the energy transition, where the big money actually goes, and we'll see clearly why private capital finds it so much easier to say yes.